and welcome to the Future of Food series. And here I'm with Raja Ramachandran, the CEO of Ripe. And the objective of this 10 by 10 interview is we spend 10 minutes with 10 CEOs to learn about the challenges in the food industry and how their companies are helping to address those challenges. Raja, I'm delighted to have you today, and thank you for joining us.
John, many thanks for having me on. Good to speak with you.
Wonderful. Raja, let's start with the tough one in 60 seconds or less. Can you tell us a little bit about you and the elevator pitch for Ripe?
Sure. In a nutshell, our technology and our platform enables all the food participants to know their food, whether it's a B2B or the B2B extension of a brand into the consumers, to answer questions like, how is my food grown? What was the quality of it? Who touched it? How was it transported? How did it get to me ultimately? And does it justify the price I pay for it? So in essence, our platform allows for that wide data capture, allows for the sharing of that information so that everyone has one eye on that record, and ultimately you get a system of truth of the whole thing. So that's what we do. And as a background, it probably doesn't make sense, but my co-founder and I both come from the financial trading industry. And, we started evaluating blockchain quite around 2014. And we worked at respective companies. Mine was R3, which is a consortium of banks and insurance companies. And Phil used to work at NASDAQ and evaluated blockchain. So that allowed us a real foundation to understand why you'd use it. And we got to a point where we wanted to do more with our lives than just financially trade. And we started looking at a bunch of alternative markets, and we landed on food. And I'll discuss how we got there.
Okay. So can you take me back to that journey that you took where you did your research and then looked at the gap in the market and then determined that blockchain was the best way to resolve that for food?
So, typically the three conditions that we try to look at to ensure that the criteria set is met for why you would use a blockchain as an alternative database. Number one, there has to be a low level of trust in some kind of ecosystem. In other words, there's low level of trust between the players, or really lack of visibility so that you can trust a record. Another piece of it is that you have siloed databases. And which you can share on a centralized database, but enabling the data attribution or the rights of ownership or the rights of use is a key piece of it. And then ultimately transactions. In other words, the need for a lack of a central party to enable that transaction set. So once those three are met, then all of a sudden you've opened the door for the use of blockchain, and many other things have to occur to justify it. So when we started evaluating, in the financial markets, much has I'd say converged around trade settlement. In other words, trade settlements are a tricky thing, whether it's a bond or a currency, and there's a lot of details behind it. And blockchain in the future, and it's happening now, is to get one record so you don't have to go through reconciliations. Reconciliations cost the industry like $15 billion. So that occurs in every vertical industry. So when we start to look at the single record, we evaluated things like insurance, healthcare, entertainment, law, cars, you name it. And then ultimately we landed on food as a result of being introduced to the folks that ran the Internet of Tomatoes project at Analog Devices. And what they did was look at marrying sensing to what makes a better tomato. And through them, we really, really took a hard look at, what actually constitutes the makeup of a tomato in terms of its supply chain, the participants, the activities, the regulation, the science, the language of the food, and so on. And so, when it came down to it, we saw that while traceability is an important feature, in other words, give me the provenance of the food, when it came down to it, it's really the insights and the intelligence that's lacking, because you're not able to see the data. You're not able to trust the other party with it. And so the blockchain changes the dynamic around trust parameters. And so we felt that that was an important condition to go forward, because mechanically you can solve for things like traceability with a regular database. So we felt like things like sustainability, the examination of the correlations between the soil, conditions of the plant, all the way through its distribution and temperature management, had a lot to do with things like, well, is it going to taste good? How long is it going to be fresh? Does it match my menu? And so on.
Yeah, gotcha. And I really like what you have on the website. You talk about the whole staff at Ripe is united by passion of for transparency and truth. So a little bit beyond trust. Can you explain or elaborate on how you came to that? So transparency and truth.
So I think in the end, truth, like I think you constantly hear these days, right? There's versions of the truth. I think, the broad stroke in the world seems to be around that. I think that the construct of truth has to come from reference of the data, reference of the source, reference of the sharing so that you can have multiple eyes on it and go, well, do we agree with this? I think in many instances, you're never going to get 100% truth acceptance, but I think that's the way that you go. And so I think that with Phil and I, we come from the financial trading business. And so people have a tendency to think of us as like Wolf of Wall Street types, and we're far from it. And so we had to make sure that we brought passionate people that had, a lot of experience in food, from farming all the way to the point of consumption, at a retailer. And so people are like, we want to know the truth about the labeling. We want to know the truth about, as things were handled. We want to know the truth about, is it authentic, right? Aren't you upset when you buy a pair of shoes and you find out you spend, $200 for a particular pair and they're fake? In fact, there was some news that China now is banning pork imports from Canada because they found that the health certificates were fraud. So truth is critical because it creates confidence and integrity in what you eat, and that will ultimately determine how you spend. So our people hail from all sorts of types. I mean, we've got a couple of grad students from the Sustainability Ag School. They were farmers. They're operational specialists. We have folks that have worked at NGOs. We've certainly got a technology team. My CTO, for example, he actually owns a small dairy farm. So he actually lives and breathes what's actually happening and understands it in a way that many don't. So they're all very, very passionate about improvement in the food supply chain. And truth is kind of the cornerstone for all of that.
Gotcha. Wonderful. Yeah, I understand that. And that's probably a good topic for a discussion for another day.
Yes.
The difference between truth and trust, and whether, truth is an antecedent and trust is an outcome. But we can maybe come back to that topic on another day. So in our next 3 or 4 minutes, what kind of challenges are you hearing from listening to your clients, potential clients, but also in observing the industry? What do you think the key challenges are right now, if you had to list the top 2 or top 3 for the food industry?
I think it's really understanding, the optimal use of a technology like blockchain in the context of all the other technologies that are available. Like our larger customers that are more institutional, like consumer products goods or large co-ops and associations, typically it begins with an innovation group that define a particular problem. And so they go, well, let's test out blockchain. Now, when they test out blockchain, you drill down to a use case and say, all right, what is it that we're trying to achieve? Through that exposition, what they find out is less about blockchain per se, but more about what is the required change potentially to adapt to it. To, in other words, maximize what you get out of blockchain, which is this notion of a single trusted record. And so we see things from like large enterprises about, they see value in just literally integrating 3 ERP systems worth of data on one single dashboard. It's hard for them to achieve that on their own. They also have interesting, particularly for ones that are geographically spread, when they're sourcing from places like Western Africa or Northern South America, there's some cultural and there's some, hidden things that they don't necessarily know about. And so all of a sudden putting transparency to it makes it interesting, and they learn more about their organization through this process and so on. So in the end, I think that it's less about the technology. I think there's enough vetting going on that the people will find out. It's really the why, like what exactly are you trying to achieve of it? And how is it then, do you look at the cost structure or the investment necessary? So critical mass is key, getting enough volume of content and players and activity. Then it's like the financial markets. Without that, you don't have liquidity, and without liquidity, you have no exchange. And so in that sense, I think that's, a piece of it. Data standards, I think, will be a factor. I think it's going to come down to what is the appropriate means of a data standard to engage interoperability, because that's the goal, right? Is to make sure that you jump into one system and you can talk to many. So GS1's doing a very good job at it. We're on a call today, and so we have some plans around it. So yeah, it's those types of things. It's small steps, enough adoption, and then I think people will then point out the why.
Gotcha. And do you think the conversations around the challenges, and especially using blockchain, are those conversations different in the US versus overseas markets? We have about 1.5 minutes left, and I have another question after this one. But are the conversations different in the US versus outside of the US with regard to adoption of blockchain?
Since we have a short time, I'll say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there's a commonality of the food of elements of the food supply chain that people look to blockchain to solve. Difference in that the market sizes and the market complexities are entirely different. So the conversation in Australia, Asia, Africa, they are very different. They're solving different things. So that's a longer topic. And I would say that in the end, the commonality is like, figuring out what's the optimal use for the blockchain in a supply chain.
Gotcha. Well, Raja, 10 minutes goes very, very quickly, but I do have one final question. You're up in front of 50 food startups. These are 50 companies that have new, beautiful products that they want to bring to market. You're a seasoned veteran of the industry. What guidance would you give them?
Number one, join our platform. That's the first thing I would definitely do. The second piece is technology is really a means to an end. It really depends on what type of food element that you have, and then what technologies do you want to apply. I think in the end, if the technology is enabling to your business goals, that's the focus as opposed to the flavor of the day for tech. But it's a complicated evaluation. Do I use DNA trackers? Do I work with Appeal Sciences and have new sort of ways in which we can manage freshness, to a harvester of lettuce that uses water to cut at 10,000 meters per second versus a regular stainless steel blade which rusts out the so it's hugely complicated. I think in the end it's like, what's your business? What tools do you need to achieve your outcome?
Yeah, wonderful. Well, that's it, folks, and thank you so much to Raja for the 10 minutes of wisdom. I want to wish you and the team at Ripe.io the very best and continued success, and looking forward to hearing more about Ripe as we move forward.
Thanks, John. Appreciate you having us on.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.